$2.1 billion annually trying to maintain provider directories. That's, payers like Humana and our competitors, physician practices, hospitals, everyone involved spends a lot of money. And Humana in particular spends a lot of money trying to maintain our provider directory for our members when they want to go out to humana.com and try and find a doctor. And it's costly not only to kind of manage that directory and find out when providers move or retire, or we get new contracts with new folks on them, whatever the case may be, but also when we're wrong and members complain about it, then CMS can fine us as well. So there's been a recent proposal that CMS may fine payers as much as $25,000 per day per instance that our directory data is wrong. And so they haven't started doing that yet, but they very well could. So Humana has been investing in exploring blockchain technology on how we can work together as an industry to help lower this cost. And so one of the things that we've done is we have joined as a founding member of the Synaptic Health Alliance, which is currently a group of, or founded by a group of 5 companies, us, Humana, United Healthcare, Optum, Quest Diagnostics, and Multiplan. And we really had 2 main goals when we sort of founded this alliance. The first being, can we use blockchain technology to create a provider data marketplace in order to sort of crowdsource this directory data so that we all don't have to spend tens of billions of dollars every year maintaining it. And then 2, since provider data is fairly benign in that it's publicly available, there's no PHI or any of those kind of concerns. It doesn't offer us really any sort of competitive advantage because our competitors get the same data as well. So it's kind of a good first step into the blockchain world and helping to, for us to determine if blockchain technology is something that we could use in a more complex problems like member data in order to collaborate efficiently as an industry.
All right, so this is these are the 2 blockchain tech stacks that we explored, Quorum and Cadena. What's really interesting about Cadena is that it was actually started by the same people who developed Quorum at JP Morgan product. It's an enterprise, so Quorum is an enterprise-focused version of Ethereum. I don't know if you guys know what Ethereum is, you should. And Cadena is the one that we chose to go with for our Humana BOLO product. We've actually been working with Cadena for about a year before being exposed to Quorum, which is actually the choice that was selected by the Synaptic Health Alliance. Working with Cadena. So PACT. This is Cadena's smart contract language. It's Haskell-based. It's human readable, like the on-ledger code. It's key row and common-like database metaphor. It's really similar to SQL. It's immutable, exposed to HTTP endpoints for interaction. So the tooling that we use was PACT REPL and the Atom plugin for it. What's really cool about this is that literally you don't even have to run the code to know if there's something wrong with it. It just lets you know, go to the next line, and there's a little dot next to it, and it tells you the line number that's wrong. So I thought that was really cool. I'd never seen that before. Unfortunately, there's not very much support on this, just because it was so new. There's nothing on Stack Overflow. Try Googling, you're not going to get much. We were able to get a lot of great support though from Cadena. We had a contract and there's no lambda functions.
Yeah, so here's an example of some packed code here, and you can kind of see its syntax is kind of different from what you typically see when you look at code. And so just kind of high level here, there's just a few main sections, and so you start with a module, and your module is sort of your smart contract, and so you can have multiple modules that make up your code base. In this case, we're creating a module by module. And like Crissa said, Pact uses a database sort of metaphor. So when we define a module, we can define a schema that goes along with it. And here we've just kind of picked three fields: ID, which is going to be an integer; user ID, which is a string; and a message, which is a string. And then, after we define our schema, then we define a table. We call it my table, and then indicate that it's going to use my schema as its schema. So whenever we were to insert data into that table, like we do in add user message, we just insert some data into the table that we've defined with some key. In this case, our key is ID. And then the rest there being the JSON payload that's going to make up that transaction for that key. And that's the ID, user ID, and message. Under the hood, Pact is actually using SQLite to store the transaction log in its ledger. When you start Pact up, you kind of give it a path to some directory where it can put all those files, and then you can go out, you can open up that SQLite file with a SQLite tool and actually see the transactions. This key, and then here's the JSON payload that corresponds to that key. And you can go in there and you can fairly easily see sort of what data has been added to the blockchain. Here's an example from the actual BOLO code base. I just kind of wanted to show this here to show that it can get a little hairy with the parens sometimes. And so this function would be one that we would call whenever we wanted to get orders that match one of those four criteria in its argument list there. So maybe we want to get active or inactive orders. And so in that case, we would pass in true or false for his active, and then sort of nothing for the rest of them, and then it would find us those. But we can also get more specific and say, give me all of the record or the orders that are active, that were created by Humana, and have some hash. And that's kind of how we get to the select where style of query that we might write in SQL. So when we're working with quorum, and so like Crissa said, quorum is sort of the blockchain stack that the Alliance has chosen that we're going to work on. It's based on Ethereum, so basically anything that applies to Ethereum more or less applies to quorum as well. And like Cadena, you write smart contracts for quorum, and you use a language called solidity to do that. Solidity is influenced by C++, Python, and JavaScript, and when we look at an example here in a second, we'll see that it looks kind of like TypeScript, if you're familiar with TypeScript, so like JavaScript with types. So much more what we're used to when we look at code as opposed to the Pact example. Solidity is also a high-level language, so it has to be compiled to actually run on the Ethereum virtual machine. In contrast with Cadena, there is so many more tools available for quorum and Ethereum, like you might expect. Most of those are open source tools. We've been using Visual Studio Code. There's a ton of plugins for VS Code for Ethereum that can give you syntax highlighting, snippets, autocomplete, all that kind of stuff that you would come to expect in your editor when you're working. And then there's 3 other tools here: Truffle, Ganache, and Drizzle, which are part of a suite of tools called the Truffle Framework, which we've been using in the Alliance to help get things moving. So Truffle is a good tool for just your day-to-day development tasks. So you can use Truffle to create a new project, so like scaffolding, your file structure, all of that stuff, compiling your contracts, deploying your contracts to the blockchain, and testing your contracts. Ganache here is a local blockchain kind of development tool. So you will just install it, and it'll create an instance of the blockchain running one node on your machine, and you'll use that in tandem with Truffle to deploy your contracts to it to test, and also if you had a UI, they can connect to the endpoint that Ganache exposes. And then Drizzle are some tools. It's a collection of front-end libraries, and so primarily focused on the React ecosystem. So you get some nice integrations with Redux to where you can kind of get data from the blockchain into your application store to be used with however you want on the front end. And we haven't really done anything with Drizzle at all at this point. The application that we've been working on for the past year or so is a Vue application. So most of those tools targeting the React ecosystem, we just haven't looked into it yet. So there might be some good tools for Vue apps out there. There might not. So that's one thing that we've still got to investigate. And then finally, for support on the quorum side, just right off the bat, like Ethereum is pretty widely known in the blockchain space, and so just because of that, like the number of resources that are available are just totally blow away Cadena. One of the nice things about getting started is the Truffle Suite provides a full collection of tutorials on like doing anything you might want to do on Ethereum. So that's really been helpful for us as we start to ramp up. Like I said, we've kind of been working on pack side of things for the majority of the last year. So we're still trying to get up to speed with the quorum side as well. One really nice thing about Ethereum is there's like a dedicated Stack Exchange site for it, so you can go and ask questions, or more likely like see the question that you have that someone else posted and get the answer to. And then they have a Gitter chat that you can just go in there and just start asking questions, and then the community is really great about being able to provide quick feedback that way. And then internally to the Alliance, we've got some partners who not only have been great working and building what we have for Quorum already, but kind of do this as a hobby in their own time. And so they've been a great resource for us as we start to get ramped up. They can answer some of those gotchas that they first stumbled with when they were learning Ethereum, and kind of give us that baseline to grow from. So here's some example Solidity code. This would be the same contract that we looked at in the Cadena side of things. Again, where we just have our 3 properties: user ID, and message. Like I said, it looks pretty standard to modern Java, or pretty similar to modern JavaScript. Instead of a class, we define things as contracts, and then it defines some properties, and it has a constructor to create a new instance of it. So you pass in the values there into the constructor as arguments, and then just set those to internal. When you do that, it's going to create an instance of the contract on the network, and you'll get an address at which you can reference that contract from later. And when you go to want to pull data back like out of the blockchain, you'll need that address in order to be able to actually see the data, because in Ethereum, all of the data stored on the blockchain is stored as hexadecimal values, and as a result, it is not human-friendly at all. That was one of the things we just started doing the last couple weeks. Is we've got 100,000 or so records for providers in the state of Texas that we've been working with the Alliance, and we need to send those into the quorum network, and the contracts for that, like after we deploy it, like we don't really have a good way to see like did it actually make it up there or not, because like everything is just sparkly goop when you go look at it in the blockchain explorer. And so we'd have to write a specific smart contract to be able to go and kind of translate that for us so that we can see the data back on the other side. So we've learned quite a few lessons as we've been working over the past year or so with the blockchain. The first being that that the blockchain is very different from what I'm used to, especially when you start to get into the Ethereum side of things. But one of the things that we've learned is that compute can be very expensive on the blockchain, and that you wouldn't want to do things where there's like some sort of calculation or process that has to be done. You want to try and pass in all of that stuff to your smart contracts ahead of time, so that there's a minimal layer of things that you can do. On the Cadena side, it's kind of nice because they don't really give you a lot of functions to be able to do those kinds of things. There's like simple addition and subtraction type things, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot. And so it kind of really forces you to think about things differently. And for us, we have an API layer that sits on top of the Cadena blockchain. And so we'll send data to that, and then that will do a lot of that translation for us, and then send it down into the blockchain after all that processing has been done. There's some cons to that side effect, though, because there's nothing really that says you have to use our API to send data to the blockchain. If you knew the URL that the Cadena endpoints were exposed on, then you could just send it in directly, and you wouldn't necessarily get all of those the additional stuff that happens in that layer above. On the Ethereum side, the same thing kind of applies, but it's even like easier to find the URL to send data to, and has the same kind of cons with like nothing makes you go through that layer. And so one of the things that we've talked about at the Alliance level is like address validation. So if we say a doctor practices at 123 Main Street in Suite 100, but we abbreviate Suite STE, and United says that that same doctor practices at 123 Main Street, Suite 100, but spells out Suite, then we've got to be able to normalize those addresses so that they look like they're the same. So when we hash them, they're going to be two different values, and to the system, it's going to look like two unique addresses. So that validation layer is one thing that we kind of are looking at doing above the blockchain, but it kind of has those negative side effects of like, how do we ensure that people that are on the network are actually going through that layer above the blockchain and not just going to the blockchain directly. So these are problems and conversations that are ongoing with the Alliance as we try and kind of figure out sort of the best way to do these kinds of things. Another thing that I've really started to learn, especially here in the last couple of weeks, is that the blockchain can have a pretty steep learning curve, especially on Ethereum. And having worked on Cadena for so long, where it sort of has that database metaphor that we're probably familiar with, like, and that's kind of eased it in, but then you start looking at Ethereum stuff, and it's just very, very different, and kind of takes you, pause and have to kind of maybe unlearn some of the things that we learned while we were working with Cadena, because Ethereum just doesn't work the same way, or doesn't have something that translates to how Cadena does it. One of the things that I've seen with this here recently is just kind of what happens when you use like an Ethereum client to like call a function on a smart contract. Like you have to take the function signature and hash that using a very specific algorithm. And then you take the first 4 bytes of that hash, which equates to the first 8 characters. And then you have to take your arguments and convert those to hexadecimals, pad them to, I forget how many bits, and you end up with this really, really long string of nonsense that represents a function call. And how you are supposed to be able to look at that without the help of a library, I have no idea. Because it's like I said, it's very different. And that's sort of been kind of what we've been working through the last couple weeks as we've kind of turned our attention to Quorum and taking what we've created over the last year and getting it to work with things that the Alliance is building is how do we bridge those gaps between Cadena and Ethereum. Sort of the last thing that I've kind of learned over the last year or so is that blockchain seems to me at least like there's a lot of really niche use cases. It's really great in the case of the Alliance where we want to have trustless relationships with our partners. We could have just as easily created a SQL Server database that held all of this data in it, and then had one of our partners, host that database somewhere, AWS or wherever. But then, sort of there's that one central person or group that stood it up that we then have to trust. And when we're talking about competitors, we don't necessarily want to have to trust them. Having the blockchain technology there kind of creates that trustless relationship where, United, for example, couldn't do any funny business, and we couldn't do any funny business and say, yeah, we bought all these records from whomever when we really didn't, because the blockchain is going to be able to call us out on that when everyone has a copy of the ledger. But beyond that, I really struggle to see what other use cases you might have where the blockchain is better than just a regular database. It sort of turns the whole thing we're used to upside down for what seems like relatively minimal value. But as things in the blockchain space continue to progress and new technologies are developed and added, maybe that'll change. But for now, I just really struggle to see how I would use a blockchain, to as a data store for any sort of meaningful project. Does anyone have any questions for us?
So when are we going to have a reliable proprietary directory?
Well, we finished a pilot on the beginning of October, and so we took it's roughly 600,000 provider records from the state of Texas, where all of the Alliance members had overlap, and what we found was generally the group of the 4 of us, Optum doesn't have any data, they're providing the blockchain expertise, but is that we're all right around 60% current. And that doesn't necessarily mean that 40% of our data is wrong. It means maybe we have the right address but the wrong suite number, or we have a phone number that takes you to a central appointment scheduling office and not necessarily the actual office, right? So we kind of had hoped that it would be better than that, but I think we kind of all realized that that was going to be the case. And so sort of our next steps are, how do we build out an MVP of this marketplace in order to continue to learn what it is we need to learn in order to get to a better place. We had originally hoped that, we would have all this data out there and people could buy and sell it, but when everyone's data is like, 60% good, no one's gonna wanna spend actual money to buy records that we know are not gonna get us there. So we kind of had to take a step back and reshuffle things and think about things and all that. So it's kind of maybe a long way of saying that not anytime soon, but at least with respect to this effort. But continuing into 2019, our hope is that we're going to continue to make good progress. We're going to continue to learn great things with these partners, and that's going to ultimately get us to a place where not only we have reliable provider directory, but maybe we kind of turn the industry on its head a little bit with the way that we're collaborating and just the huge opportunity for cost savings that it presents.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
With that collaboration, what have you learned so far? Like, what future opportunities do you see for collaborating between those companies?
Yeah, so if everyone's familiar with Blue Button data, API and some of the things that have been going on with that effort, right now it's only for traditional Medicare beneficiaries. So at some point we suspect CMS is going to have us provide that for Medicare Advantage as well. But imagine if we could put, actual health information of our members on the blockchain in a secure way, so that when someone switches from, Cigna to us, or whatever the case may be, we can actually go get that data that they have and get a better historical picture of what that individual's health might look like. Feed that into other systems to help, find the right plan for them, help, any number of things that we can work on. So, I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I also think, with respect to collaboration, this opens up the door for new companies to be created, where we've provided this vast data set of data where instead of hiring vendors to go help us manage it, new companies could come in and start validating stuff on the blockchain for us and buy and sell it. It creates new relationships with those new companies and hopefully reduces the costs that we have to incur to call providers or sort through and figure out why something's bad. So I think there's a few different things that could come from that. Yes.
Who have been the users of this pilot? It sounds like provider and payer. Are those the two kind of user groups that you guys are working with, or are there others?
Yeah. So here at Humana, there's a group called DCAV who are responsible for maintaining our provider directory. We've been kind of thinking of them as our main user. They're the folks that are kind of in the front line when whatever event goes out that says we were wrong about this particular provider. They did it in their queue, and they'll start their investigation process. They also work with several vendors who, C3 is a big one where they just have huge call centers and they can churn through thousands of calls a day for us. So we've been working very closely with them, and then also the same kind of teams at other companies. So specifically United has been really great to work with. They've been giving us a lot of good feedback and the application that we've been developing on how we can make it more useful. So that's always great and welcome. But then beyond that, it starts to get a little bit more fuzzy because we are still kind of in the early stages, and when you think about actually spending Humana's money on records, that's probably not something that just anyone would do, right? And so it may result in like organizational changes or changes to the software itself to better tailor it to a particular group or team.
Is it a closed consortium or closed group? I mean, like you said, United, does that mean Aetna could come in if they wanted, or?
Yeah, so I believe Aetna is joining, right, Kyle? Some point. So there is a process to join the alliance. We've been talking with Aetna. There's also a large provider in Texas called Ascension Health that we've been talking with, which could be potentially a gold mine for us, because who better to say where Dr. Smith practices than Dr. Smith's employer. So we hope that there's some potential there. And then also there's even been talk of like Cognizant or some of these other IT consulting and staffing companies that can also join to help out with development efforts. Because there's a lot of work to do. So exactly what the process to join is, I'm not entirely sure, but I do know there's like a buy-in and some legal agreements and all of that kind of stuff you have to go through.
And then the two different structures that we're talking about, are they using the same underlying crypto system that Bitcoin or the others are using, or is it something proprietary when it went from JP Morgan to what we're using now?
So Quorum is going to use all the same things that Ethereum uses, so that's pretty standard. On the Cadena side, they use I think some different algorithms. Blink 2 is a big one that they use, but we're going to be in the process of likely migrating from Cadena to Quorum, just long-term stability for the alliance. I think as great as working with Cadena has been, I think for some of the reasons we highlighted with tooling and support, like Quorum makes a lot more sense just because of the resources that are available for it. Here we've got a few links for some reading. So the first one is the Pact documentation, some white papers that Cadena have written, and then some tutorials for getting started with Ethereum. Also not on here, I kind of disappointed myself for forgetting it. synaptichealthalliance.com is the website for the alliance that we're participating in. We also have a white paper out there that is available to read and download as well.